I was just thinking like, so many people use Google Workspace as their default like company stack or Notion or something. Like, there's no reason why in a modern company on your way into work you couldn't listen to a podcast that was like everything that happened at the company yesterday. And like, what a
Right.
better way to keep track of what's going on, especially as like if you're a remote company or if you're not in the office every day. Like, okay, I'm on my way to work or I'm getting a coffee in the morning or something. Like, here's an engaging podcast, and it'll be better over time that just like summarizes all the conversations from yesterday. Like that is a really interesting way to share info across an organization. And if your team is 5 people, you don't need it. But dude, if you work at like Stripe or something, they have thousands of employees.
Mm.
That would be fascinating. It would bubble it up sort of bottoms up. You don't need to put in structural organization. You could just give the AI access to all of your documents that are saved. And obviously you need to have like some sharing permission. So you're not like sharing comp and payroll discussions and stuff. But like
Right.
that feels amazing, right? Because so much of the overhead of keeping people updated is like write a status report or produce a deck or create a visual. And like the idea of having custom podcasts for every company internally. I know some companies do this already, but it's a lot of overhead. You need to schedule interviews. You need to have separate time carved out. And like, that's just going to go away. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I think of like so I think Keith Raboy and I don't know if he got it from Jack Dorsey or if they just agree on it, but I think they're both believers in like sort of radical transparency when it comes to, organizations. And
Yeah.
I know Keith has talked about like and this will connect back to the what is it? Note LLM? What's it called?
Yeah. Notebook LLM,
Notebook LLM.
which is like
Yeah,
the most
so
Google name, just like the most Google name for an amazing product. It was like buried on this weird web page. The UI didn't make any sense. And it was like the most amazing technological marvel that I've played with in months. And I'm like, what the hell? Like, this should be on the homepage.
yeah, I mean I saw this from someone on Farcaster actually, and then I went to it and it took me a minute to realize it was Google. So I guess the one good thing maybe that they did, or I guess you could argue it's not a good thing for them, but they seem to have abstracted Google away, to a
Yeah.
reasonable degree. But I quickly, realized it's like a subtitle or something that it's a Google thing. But I was just kind of surprised to your point. It's like they've been pretty loud about these other announcements, and like this one, I didn't even see
Right.
any announcement, and it's like this is pretty sick. But yeah, there's also something going on in the AI space. It seems that the naming is just like horrific. Like, I mean,
Right.
I'm like ChatGPT, you have to sort of, I have to doubt my criticism a little bit because it's like, well, the product has been so enormously successful. It's like, even if I think
It
it's a
doesn't matter
bad
what they
name,
it doesn't
maybe
matter what
it's,
they called it. It doesn't matter
yeah,
what they called it. It was a miracle that it was like it's
yeah,
like an alien landed on Earth. It was like it doesn't matter,
yeah,
what the biologists name it.
exactly. So like, imagine if they actually did give it, like, if I go with my general, assumption that it is a pretty horrible name, it's like, imagine if they actually gave it a great name, like how much even more, successful it could have been. Or it could be. And the same with Notebook. It's like these are just like horrible names. Like probably don't include the acronym for the specific
Yeah,
technology in the name.
technology.
Like there's no need, like there's just absolutely no need for that. No one else
Right.
does that. So anyway, what was I gonna say? Oh, on the radical transparency. So yeah, Keith Raboy has this thing that's like you know, uh basically organizations should be like way more transparent. And he cites sports organizations as sort of a case study where um for a specific dimension. So like you mentioned that, maybe there's a few things that you want to be like very transparent about things, like everyone knows what's going on in every meeting and whatever. But like, except for when it comes to maybe like payroll or like HR, like a few like
Yeah.
very specific things. And what he says is like, I believe in radical transparency, and just to like sort of, demonstrate. And like some people are like, well, you should carve out like payroll out of that transparency principle. And he's like, okay, maybe. But just to even address that one, if you look at sports organizations, everyone knows what everyone's getting paid. And that doesn't really, I mean, you have problems. You have people who, hold out because they think they're worth more than another guy or whatever. But like at the end of the day, it all gets dealt with. And I think sports are actually really interesting as, sort of these like organizational case studies or, things to look at because, and you have some of
Yeah.
these some of the best books around organizations are coming from, he's got his big reference, which is, the score case takes care of itself by Bill Walsh. I also absolutely
Totally.
love the book. It's actually the same author, Steve Jameson, who wrote the Bill Walsh book, or, helped Bill Walsh write it or whatever, who wrote a book on John Wooden, which I actually like better.
Oh,
So
yeah,
like these sports books, like, and Phil Jackson's got some books that are pretty good. There's like a bunch of these.
totally.
And
And Reed Hastings of Netflix has the same comparison, right? Where he's like, we're a sports team, not a family, talking about the
Right,
organizational culture. That's like the famous
right.
Netflix quote.
I didn't realize he had that, but I like this. People always talk about companies as a family, and I always think of that. Like, I think it's a team more than a family. And then on the other hand, you do get teams that talk about themselves as a family. So it's like at the end of the day, it might all sort of boil down to the same thing. But I think a team is like sort of a better analogy. And so, anyway, what he says is like, it works in sports leagues, and I think, or with sports teams. And what I think is also interesting just about sports organizations is, if you think about, I mean, well, I'll probably set you off on a riff here on Teal. I think, I love Teal. Obviously, a lot of people, um, that we hang out with, or especially on the internet at least, are big Teal people. But I feel like you're one of those very high percentile Teal people, and like you go into the derivatives of Teal, like the Gerard and
Right.
whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And uh, and so anyway, oh man, what was I saying? Oh, so he talks about, like, competition is for losers. Um, and it all makes sense. Like, if you're in this super competitive industry, like on the business side, if you're trying to rise through the ranks in banking or law or whatever, like there's only so many spots on the Supreme Court. There's only so many like head of, investment banking groups, like whatever. Um, and so generally like avoid competition, but that's like from a optimizing for the individual, like for the player. If you're optimizing for like the industry itself, I think competition is amazing. Like competition brings out the best in everyone who's competing, because it's so competitive. Like these other routes, you want to avoid competition because competition's the hardest. Like if you can do something that's more unique, you don't have to be as exceptional because not as many people are like doing it. And so what I think is interesting about sports is like these are the most competitive, arguably the most competitive arenas in the world. Like these are massive industries, in terms of like, the revenue of these leagues and the value of these teams, like huge money on the line to like get the best of the best competition. And, every year we have a champion in like every league. And so I think there's like a lot to be learned by how these teams operate. And like maybe in the old days, you know, it's like not that informative to look at how the Patriots operate if you're trying to run forward. But for the future, like you don't really need, probably in a lot of cases. I mean, obviously in like, hard world or hard tech or whatever, but like in a lot of cases, you're not going to need an organization any bigger than the New England Patriots to create like, $100 billion companies or whatever it is. And so like you can actually follow, rather than having to like take this, whatever, if it's a basketball team, including front office or whatever, there are, tens and hundreds of people. But whatever it is, it's like you don't have to take this smaller organization and look at it and like take some lessons and like apply them to a larger organization. Like you can actually just operate like these basketball teams or baseball teams or football teams. And the reason I guess I got on that tangent is because this thing that you mentioned with the, recording these podcasts, I think that's like a lot of these, I think the transparency is something that you see from some of the best organizations, and something that like Keith pointed out related to sports organizations. And, it's something that does require a lot of manual work to make happen, or at least has. And to your point, if you have meetings that are automatically recorded and transcribed and summarized and then reproduced, at an organizational level into like a 5-minute summary of the day, that's just like a fully autonomous process that can be amazing for context sharing across the organization. So that'll be really interesting. And there's just like so many organizations just are changing so fundamentally. It feels like that it's very hard to, it's hard to think about, like there's too many things impacting almost.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to think about.
I'm struck by a few things. One is like, so I've run the open compensation experiment, right? We did that the entire 3 years of Bright Moments. Everyone's payroll was on chain. And
Huh,
that wasn't out of any particular reason to try to be innovative, but it was just, that's the default that Ethereum gives you
right.
is transparency and a lack of privacy, right?
Yeah.
And so like we ran that experiment, and I would say, on net, it was probably neutral towards good. There were some problems that came up that it came up with, but they were mostly problems that would have had to be solved eventually. They just sort of accelerated it. Like
Right.
I think you should
Which
just
maybe
always
is
assume.
beneficial.
I think so. You should just always assume that employees are going to compare notes. And it's weirder to me that they don't, and you see companies like, I think levels.fyi is a big one where you like have open comp and things like that. And like, it's just always, it's more surprising to me that more people don't compare notes with their coworkers around compensation, because I think it would reveal a lot of just inequality that's not for any particular rationale, but just because if you joined at a certain time, this is what we have to offer, and management doesn't have an incentive to correct this because no one will ever get corrected downwards. People only get corrected upwards. And so you have this salary creep, and if that happens across the organizational level, the only way to get rid of it is through layoffs, right? And
Right.
so if like basically the self-correcting mechanism goes from, okay, some people get paid a little bit less, but they stay at the company, to everyone gets paid more, but there's fewer employees, because if you assume payroll is sort of a fixed expense that's going to get corrected to around the same level, that's just what happens. And so like, yeah, I think the experiment, it just forces management to be a little bit more thoughtful when making compensation decisions, because it's immediately transparent. Um, and I think more on-chain organizations will default to it, not out of willingness to experiment, because I think companies have tried that in the past, especially in the Valley, and it's mostly blown up. But just because that's what it gives you out of the box. So that's one thing. The other is, with like management, it's shocking to me how the leaders of large, what seem like successful organizations from the outside, feel as though their organization is horribly broken. And I'll give three examples. Right, one is Brian Chesky with Airbnb. This sort of thing that the whole founder mode debate came out
Right.
of Brian basically saying like my organization was totally broken, and it was because I took the common advice, right, of like delegating and letting people do whatever they wanted. And so that's like one example of, okay, well, maybe our frameworks are just totally broken. Another one is John and Patrick Collison, who I just think are some of the, most well-read and best managers that we have today, as an example. And early on at Stripe, they used to CC everybody on every email. Like by default, it would CC a mailing list, and you would just be copied on every email, like on BCC. So, the
Mm.
outgoing party couldn't see it, but inside the company, and like that didn't scale because you would just end up getting hundreds or thousands of emails per day.
Right.
But that they did that very early on, and that was clearly out of a desire to like try new management approaches. And then third, Toby Lutke, who's the founder and CEO of Shopify, not to be confused with Spotify, which is another European-born founder with a green logo. Toby's based out of Canada. Toby's based out of Canada, and he had a conversation with Tyler Cowen recently, where he was talking about like just how bad management is, and in like 30 or 40 years, we're going to look back at the current class of companies, and it's going to be like this horribly primitive style where you have all these policies and these processes that essentially make it so no one can make any major mistakes, but nobody can really do great work either, because you sort of
Mm.
have to apply some blanket policy across the organization. And so, yeah, I like DAOs are not a great experiment. They haven't been going well so far, and I think producing like innovative products. But I do think that there's clearly some need for experimentation at the organizational level that is it's serving as like a release valve for. I just wish it didn't come with a lot of the other drama that happens.
Right. So, those are three really interesting examples. I think a couple of things. One is like just a small note, but I think related to the comp issues on that very specific point. One other thing that I think Raboy talks about is I don't know if he actually practices this or if he has, but like just having basic, or maybe Teal actually. I think this might be Teal's thing, which is like you just have two classes of comp, and that way you don't have like creep, you don't have all these comparisons. And like maybe creep is okay in these sports leagues because actually these like leagues are growing and the team values are growing and like everything's sort of growing, so you can afford to have this creep where every year you have a new highest paid player or quarterback or whatever. But in organizations, unless you're growing at a certain pace, maybe that's not reasonable. And so just having these two tiers, like you're either a more senior guy or a more junior guy, and like there's two bands and that's it, and like the CEO gets paid in the top band, and so like you can't argue you should be paid more than the CEO. I think that's like an interesting approach as well, that just sort of like bubbles it. I don't know that it probably has its flaws as well, but just to sort of like point that out or call that out as a specific solution. The other thing on the on the management thing, it reminds me of this like sort of concept that I think about a lot, which is, um, you can, I forget who it was. It might have, I almost want to say it was Toby, but like, I don't think it probably wasn't. I can't remember who it was, but someone was saying like, it actually might have been Toby, but it was basically someone saying like, look, um, running like a software company was, or just more generally, like sort of a tech company is like a relatively new thing.
Mhm.
Like it's not, I'm not talking about like necessarily like only like 2000s or something, but, um, since like the Traitorous Eight or whatever, like it's sort of like, I don't know, 50 or 70 years old or like something like that, like on that order, and like a few decades or something, or several decades. But this like sort of newer generation is the first generation, like the CEOs of the last 20 years, or even, arguably less maybe, is like the first generation that could learn from a previous generation, like in a material way. You had like
Yeah.
sort of these originals, and then you had, and you probably know a lot more about all this than I do, but like you have sort of this like original class, like true OGs, like Arthur Rock's investing and like whatever. And then you have like, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and,
Mm.
whoever else around that time. And then like and those guys were the first guys who like, they did have a few early examples to learn from. Um, and there's just like sort of a whole class of like CEOs around, around that time. Um, and then you have like this newer generation that actually has sort of like a second generation to learn from, that
Right.
they're not just learning from the first people who are just like throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. They're learning from the second generation who like actually had some frameworks to go off of, like some
Totally.
guidance to follow, some idea of what could work. And then so like there's sort of some principles that seem reasonably sound. And then they learn from them. And so like now you actually are like for the first time starting to have like actual like organizations that are run, a bit better for that reason. But the problem with it is that, I think like you can learn from these prior generations, but the context is completely different.
Yeah.
Learning how to
Yeah.
run how organizations were run 20 years ago, there might be some helpful principles, but if you just completely ignore the fact that AI exists and like you can do way more as one person with like sort of the leverage of technology than you could 20 years ago, like you're just going to not be operating on the right assumptions. And so this concept that I think about like more generally a lot is that, um, who to learn from. And basically it's like you can you can learn from the most successful people of all time, in whatever you're trying to do. But most of the content from them, if you know that they're the most successful people of all time, then by definition they've already succeeded tremendously. And
Mhm.
most of what there is to learn from them is like sort of after they've done that success. Like people don't really want their advice before they're successful. So mostly they're
Right.
like writing the books and, whatever, like after the success. And everyone, it's just like sort of a human thing that like you can't have like perfect recall and like how things went, and memory gets distorted, and you
Totally.
attach rationale to things that was not genuinely the case. And so, um, overall, these people tend to like way over, um, over attach things to like being lucky,
Yep.
when like really there's almost always like some underlying things. There is blind luck, but there's also like almost always like some underlying things that they're doing. Certainly wasn't like complete luck. Um, and so it's like, who do you want to learn from? And in my view, it's you want to take. First of all, I don't like learning from like a ton of people. It's just more of like a personal preference. And I like to have like a few specific people, and you want to, or at least per area, or like per thing. And so you want to find people, I think, that you have like tremendous conviction. Like maybe they already have signs of success, like probably they should. It's sort of like this, it's a risk reward thing, but you want to find people who are not, who you think are going to become like the most amount more successful than they already are, basically. They should end up being outliers, but they should currently be sort of like in the pack still. And the reason is that you can then learn from them while they're doing what they're doing. And then the sort of workaround here is that's sort of a risky game, because if you pick someone and it turns out their strategy actually blows up in their face, like they have all these things they feel really strongly about, they talk with complete certainty that this is like the right way to do it, and then like it
Totally.
completely backfires and you followed their instructions all the way, and like so it backfires on you. Um, and so the workaround is that you can go and you can read, a book about Steve Jobs that was written in the 80s, like before he came back. And it's like, okay, then you're learning from Steve Jobs, like, he already built a great company, but he hadn't started his like, real,
It was it
the
wasn't
comeback.
mythological.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is pre, iPod, pre iPhone and everything. And so you can do that, but then again, like I'm sort of doing like a little bit of a circular reference here. It's a little less organized than I would like it to be, but basically, so you can do that, and that's like a good thing, because then it's like, okay, these people made it, and you can go and find the stuff that they wrote while they were doing it. Um, but the problem there is that, coming back to the original point, Steve Jobs built his company before personal computers were like a thing, let alone like AI. He's talking about AI to his credit. But with like that Socrates quote, that's like insane. But the context is then wrong. So you got the right person and you got them during the time in which there's no fault of memory. Like they're saying correctly what they're doing because they're in that time
Right.
doing that thing that ends up making them successful. But the
Right.
context of the time no longer applies. And so it's sort of like a tricky thing. And that's why ultimately I do think it is beneficial to pick people now who you think are going to be super successful. And at the end of the day, this might seem like a super obvious point, but it's like non-obvious in the sense that like it may be better to sort of like really study your favorite like Series B founder today or something than to study Steve Jobs or Jeff
Mm,
Bezos. Like that's like kind of non-obvious.
right.
So anyway, I don't know what you think about all that.
We had a discussion about this in the Silicon Valley Book Club yesterday, which is like I think a lot of people draw the wrong like there's something um about reading these books that are written after the fact that makes it seem preordained or that it was a straight shot to success. And a lot of
Right.
people actually draw the wrong lessons from that, which is like I think there's always a canonical founder of the time, and everybody that grew up or, in the 80s, looks to Steve Jobs and has like, the natural inclination towards design thinking and products and simplicity. And then there's the Zuckerberg of today, or I would say that Elon's managerial style is probably the most in vogue. And when he fired everybody at Twitter, everybody else took it as permission to go fire everyone in their company that they wanted to, but didn't feel like they could.
Right.
But I think people also draw the long lessons from like just very flawed human beings, and you see this a lot where people like try to emulate them and they just act like assholes. Or there's some cargo culting that happens where you're not actually doing the individual thing, and so it's always very hard if you're inside of a category that has a name. You're probably in the wrong place or too late. Um,
Right.
because most of these things did not have categories, and it takes a very long time for something to happen, at which point the market's not set, but the players have so much of a head start, that it's very difficult to compete with them. And to me, that's the difficult part, is knowing whether or not you're in a space that's going to become a category but isn't one yet, or if you're still way out in the deep and is way off target and there's actually not a trend coming at all.
Right. Yeah. I feel like, it's on the one hand, it's like you're in the wrong area. On the other hand, there's like sort of the timing thing where it's just like very easy to be too early and very hard to be on. It's very easy to be too late. It's very easy to be too early, and it's very hard to be
Totally.
on time. And yeah, I guess the overarching thing is, at the end of the day, I mean, the way that I lean at least is just really trying to think for myself, and like do things even if they seem dumb. I feel like the benefits of ignorance and originality. Maybe this itself is an ignorant point, but I feel that they can outweigh um, all of the things you might miss by being more familiar with, quote unquote, like best practices or the, best examples before you, with just, a few things that you do differently that like sort of couldn't have come from that other model of, working off of templates. And that could be totally wrong, but it's also just a personal preference. I think that, what are you here to do if not to do things the way that you want to? Um, so that's sort of the way that I like to go about it, at least. But you're always going to have influences, and so that's more so like what I was talking about is like if you're going to choose those influences, it's kind of that's how what we talked about is sort of how I think about choosing them. And the cool thing is now, previously it'd be very hard to get someone who exists now, um, who is becoming successful now, and to hear what they're thinking about while they're thinking about it. But really, podcasts, I would say, and maybe to a lesser degree, Twitter are these relatively new things that you can get that. Where not everyone is going to have a book. And if you are successful and you're going to have a book, it's probably not going to be till after you're successful. And the memory,
Right.
again, is not working. And you're also not talking about all the failures. You're talking about the good stuff for the most part. And podcasts, that same point remains true. Like people aren't going and talking about all these failures on podcasts typically. But the long form audio tends to be more nuanced. I think that podcasts tend to be more real than really any other form of media. I think they're longer, so there's just more context than tweets. You wouldn't choose to share something maybe that you might share in a podcast as a tweet. And then books, again, it's sort of like highlights. There's editing. Podcasts are in real time, and conversations are just more comfortable. There's not as much thinking going on. And when you're thinking, you're going to be more sort of like strategic about what you're writing about or whatever. But when you're just talking, like things can come up accidentally that are like not bad to bring up, but you just wouldn't have brought up otherwise. And so it's like a better view. And so if you can, so find some people that you like while they're becoming more successful and like listen to them on podcasts, I think that's like a really interesting new model of someone to be able to get influenced by, to the extent that, you're going to get influenced by people anyway. Listening to people as they're becoming successful, who you believe in, whose principles, importantly, like it's not just looking at these people, it's like there should be some resonance there. I think that should be sort of the guiding thing. So it's like, hopefully you're thinking for yourself. Hopefully you're doing things the way that you want to do them. And as you find people who sort of like have a ton of overlap with these things, not that you just want to look for like confirmation bias to support all your opinions, but if you believe in what you believe in, then someone else who has like a lot of overlap with those, may have interesting tangential things that you didn't think about. And so like that can also be like useful guidance. I think it's like, man, this person is just like preaching to the choir. And here's this other concept they have that I didn't even think about that resonates
Mm.
so strongly. Like those are the best influences to follow for me personally, I think. So anyway, I wanted to actually, unless, if you have anything else on sort of that line, and are you good on time for a little bit? Or I know
Yeah, I'm
we're
good.
like over already. Um, so I'm also not sure what the battery life is on these Ray-Bans, but I guess we'll find out.
It'll warn you.
Yeah. So, and man, I just have to say, I just love this format. I hope the audio, I listened to the audio. I think it's pretty good. I hope it's good enough for listeners, but
Sounds
the,
fine to me.
the ability to walk, and I know you're not doing it today, but we'll make it happen soon where we're both walking, we're both on the Ray-Bans, but, the ability to walk and talk is just so much more, it's so much more enjoyable for me than being sort of at my desk. And I genuinely think that my listening, thinking, and speaking are all improved to some degree. It could be sort of biased by the fact that I'm just having more fun, that I just enjoy it more. But I do think that it's like more creative or something. I don't know. It's just like better. So
I have a theory here. Do you want to hear the
yeah,
theory?
go ahead.
This is the same reason why teenagers are more likely to be honest with their parents when they're in a car ride together than when they're sitting at the dinner table. It has to do with not seeing the other person's face and being side
Right,
by side with them.
right,
Like, I don't know. Everyone's had the experience where you're in a long car ride with someone and like you have deep conversations when someone's sitting shotgun and you're on a long car ride. And like some of that's boredom and some of that's like the driver isn't on their phone. But I think a large part of it is like you're not looking at each other. And so you're more willing to be honest. And, Paul Graham has a big riff on this. Like he used to do office hours with startups and they would like take a walk. And that was the best way to do it because you're just so much more generative and the ideas come more naturally. So I don't necessarily think it's a bias. I do think there's something probably if psychological and maybe physiological about the action, like the act of moving while talking. Like sitting is so not natural, and
Yeah.
we've somehow convinced ourselves that it's the default.
I have so many, I totally agree with that. Like I'm like 10 out of 10 on this, like in terms of how strongly I feel. Even though I don't know, it's still 10 out of 10 sort of implies certainty. Like I'm not certain and I don't know the exact mechanisms, but I'm very confident and I have a few ideas around sort of why. And one of them is what you said, the lack of eye contact. And if you sort of like, if you broaden that out a bit, it's just more broadly, uh, it's a reduction overall in sort of like the stimuli, to
Mhm.
not to like get like overly like wordy or whatever, but like basically, you know, if you have eye contact, there's first of all, like there's just like and this is gonna sound like autistic basically, but like there's a constant like sort of feedback of how are they taking what I'm saying?
Yeah,
There's probably some subconscious bit about like making eye contact or like looking around. I don't even know. And when you don't have any of that visual stuff, it's just more room for sort of like the brain to operate on just listening and just thinking and just talking. And
mhm,
the other sort of thing that I would add to that about walking is there um I think there's so first of all, I think there's your heart rate is actually a little bit higher. And so maybe like sort of everything's just operating a little bit better.
mhm,
Like the body is just like more active, basically. And
mhm.
maybe the mind can be like more active as a result. Again, that's like not super scientific, but just like sort of a hunch. And then another thing is I think there's something to be said for keeping your body occupied. Um,
Yeah,
so basically, like you're in this situation, there's no distractions other than potentially what's around you, but it's like, what's around you if you're walking is like nature and, or
totally.
at least if you're walking in a somewhat natural place and it's like nature is what comes to mind is just like nature is good. Like, and like people won't really like disagree with that. It's just like, I'm not gonna like get into describing, but it's like being surrounded by nature, like probably not hurting the situation, like almost regardless of what you're doing. And so like in this case, just like
Definitely.
having trees and green and sun and blue skies, like probably helping the situation overall. And then your body is just like is occupied in this consistent pace. And I think there's something to that as well. So I'm a big believer in the walk and talk. I've always done this. I have, I don't do a lot of like FaceTimes, even with like, family and friends. And to your point, like my best conversations are phone calls. I'll walk and talk with my dad for 2 hours. I did this, 2 hours is a little bit of a long example, but I did this literally like less than a week ago. I went for a walk, wasn't even planning on calling him. It was Saturday. He asked if I was around. We ended up talking for 2 hours. Time totally fly. I walked like
Totally.
7 miles, and I would never do that. Like I don't think we've ever sat down and talked for 2 hours in my entire life.
Right.
Like you just wouldn't. It's just like
Yeah.
not the move.
What was he doing? What was he doing?
He was walking.
Okay,
So
cool.
yeah. So I guess it runs in the family. So anyway, I want to sort of unless if feel free to bring up any topics that you want to talk about as well. But I haven't really heard about the book club that you're doing. What's it? What is Silicon Valley Canon?
Yeah.
I'm totally blanking. Yeah, it's like that's what it sounds right. So it's yeah. So I I don't want to say like I hesitate to call it a book club as well because it's like it's not your traditional book club. But I'm curious to hear. It's definitely an experiment. It's an experiment for you, like this is for me, and you put a lot more time into thinking it through and getting it started. So I'd be curious about that, and also more generally, I don't know that we've ever talked about reading, and I know that you love reading. We're talking about the owner and moderator of the books channel here, which will one day be a massive thing. But but I have this like sort of mixed. I have probably a take on reading that you won't like, and so it might be interesting to talk about. But
Sure, sure.
uh, but yeah, I don't know. First of all, I'm just curious, like, and I'm sure other people would be as well, as to what's going on with Silicon Valley Canon. And, you sort of drew out this experiment. You had some certain assumptions. Have there been surprises? Have things exceeded or underwhelmed in certain capacities? Just sort of the general brain dump.
Yeah, so I can maybe give you a little bit of background around my motivation for wanting to do it. I I've been thinking about this idea of accountability for a long time. And really when it comes to what's essentially like an autodidactic learning style, which I know I have, I know you do, I think a lot of people do as well. One of the
What does
biggest
that mean
problems
again?
with it, autodidactism is like learning through your own structure and
Right,
seeking out knowledge for its own sake. And
right.
so it's very different from structured schooling. But one of the biggest problems with it is I have a whole riff on college, but essentially you don't get the credential from it and you don't get the network from it. You get the knowledge, which I would argue is probably the most important part, but you don't have the other two aspects of what formal education provide, which is that credential and that network.
Hmm.
And university is a really heavy way to provide those things, and it's very expensive. And there's a whole bunch of other things that are bundled into it. And so my thought was, okay, can I take this thing that I practice and try to unbundle parts of the university into a very narrow curriculum of a topic that I'm very deeply versed in due to personal interest. And I wanted to do that because I didn't want to have to spend time during the club also catching up on the reading material. I wanted to be topics that I was very familiar with.
Right.
And my goal here is to create a cohort of people. Like one, I want them to have a great experience, right? So like I'm generally interested in like all of the things you need to do when you offer a product, like NPS score and making sure that people feel as though the value is good for their money and trying to be, getting the right customers. But what I really care about at the end of it is like, yes, the people got the knowledge, but also that there's some shared understanding and insights within the group that maybe aren't broadly known outside of the group. And this idea of like a shared secret among the people in the club is really interesting to me and is actually one of the things that you get from formal education that you don't get when you're learning by yourself. You don't really have the opportunity to reflect with other people. And so I've sought out these types of opportunities um, for a long time. I really enjoyed undergrad. And post undergrad, I was struck with a compulsion to go back to school because I really missed this environment. And I went so
Mm.
far as to take the GRE, look into, graduate programs. I was going to do like a dual, I was going to try to go for like a dual PhD MBA, but just the time required to do that and the monetary expense, I couldn't justify the opportunity cost. And so I've been ruminating on this concept for a long time. And I think with Hypersub and with Farcaster, it was like the right incubating ground to do it. Um, I also just think that giving people a forcing function can be helpful. Most people just want accountability to do things. I think it's like a lot of human potential is lost because of a lack of accountability. People are incredibly talented, but like it's hard to do things and you just need the momentum to do it. And it's easier to enforce it externally unless you're a very unique person. And so that's the motivation for doing it. We're 2 weeks into it, and so far so good. The my favorite part, which I wasn't even originally gonna do this, has been we have a weekly synchronous call with, people who want to show up. And the call is really interesting because you hear other people's perspectives on the readings.
Right.
Um, and it's useful because it reminds you that like your perspective while you're reading isn't the only one. And I can sort of help nudge the class in some directions because I'm very familiar with their work. And so it's like, hey, like I put these two works in because they relate to each other in this interesting way. Or there's this one reading that seems like it's way out of left field and doesn't have anything to do, but there's like some Straussian interpretation of it that's actually interesting when you think about it. Um, and then the other part of it is like I generally think that having a thing to work on makes you more appealing to other people who you want to get in touch with. And so I've used it as an outlet to reach out to a whole bunch of interesting authors and thinkers to give them a platform to come to an AMA, which otherwise I wouldn't really have had a good excuse to do. And so that's like a
Right.
little bit of my selfish motivation for doing it is, I've got a hit list of like 20 people who I really want to develop a personal relationship with. And this is a good opportunity to reach out and like a surprising number of them respond, and even if they don't say yes, they respond. And then a surprising number of number that respond say yes as well. And then it's just about
Right.
managing and tracking them down and getting the timing. Um, so I would say 2 weeks in out of 6, experiments going well. I want to get to the end of the curriculum and do a little bit of, retrospective and talk to some of the participants. But I would probably do it again on a different topic. I may run the same topic back, but I don't know. That's less interesting to me than picking another like cluster of books.
Right. And you might be able to have a cycle too. You could have an annual cycle of, you do this subject for, late summer, fall season, and then you have, two more seasons throughout the year or whatever. And like maybe the other ones change year to year, but this one you run every year because it's like one of your core ones, or maybe you have all of them repeat every year or all of them change every year. But like there's no rule book, obviously, so you can do whatever you want. I totally understand the power of the default ask.
Yeah,
Sort of what I call it, at least in terms of like having this thing that you're working on. That's an excuse to reach out to anyone.
totally.
That's what the podcast
Yeah,
has
good point.
been for me. And
Yep.
that's also what this is actually. It's like, uh, and I'm personally more interested in like at a certain point, during COVID, sort of a weird time. Like also I'd been writing for 6 months on a blog my blog, like posting every weekday. And then I had started the podcast. And at a certain point, like a few months into the podcast, I was like, why shouldn't like all almost conversations be public? Like why and recorded?
Right.
Like obviously there are answers. Not every conversation should be public and recorded. But like what happens if you flip that default from the most conversations are private to most are public, and you need a reason for them to be private rather than you need a reason for them to be public. And I've become more into that line recently where it's like with these conversations with people from Farcaster, it's like, I could just reach out to like have a conversation, but and like maybe this might sound bad. Like, I don't know. Like I'm trying, I'm not like judging myself. I'm just being honest. Like I am more, and obviously like you and I, like we talk a lot, like, it's, I keep a few, like I keep like a relatively few friends or people, people that I talk to pretty regularly. And I sort of like it that way. And, and I'm not that interested in like meeting. It's weird. Like I'm not that interested in meeting more people to become like friends, but also
Yeah.
I love learning about people and their stories. And like, I am interested, like once I get on the line. I just don't want this like overwhelming social life basically. And so it's like, I don't
Well, it
seek
doesn't
out like,
compound. The
yeah,
podcast gives you some compounding benefit to it.
yeah. And it's also beyond, it's a conversation that lives forever. And it's like, it's not a fleeting thing. And I know that like, life is fleeting. So like, this might be sort of a, futile pursuit to like make things lasting when the nature of reality is that everything is fleeting. But like, I'll do what I want to do. And like, I like things to be, like, I like these sorts of things. And so it's like, I love that now I have this, like, I'm just experimenting. Basically, this idea was bubbling up for like over a year of like Farcaster focused podcast, Farcaster focused podcast. And like, I'm like, this is a terrible time for me. Like, I'm getting married in 2 weeks. Like, I'm trying
Right.
to squeeze in some work on base colors. Like, I'm coaching basketball. Season starts when I get back from the wedding. Like, this is not a time for me to like start something new. But I'm just like, you can't ignore something for so long. You will, I use the Bezos regret minimization like framework. Like, I could see myself regretting never having tried that thing that was sort of, bubbling up for over a year. It's like pretty rare that these ideas bubble up for over a year, in a material way. And so, anyway, that's when I started. And it's like now it's like I can reach out to anyone on Farcaster. I have this default ask. It's not like, hey, I want to talk about, this specific thing or that specific thing, or I need to explain why I want to
Right.
talk. It's, I'm talking to Farcaster people. Do you want to come on for a conversation? And so far it's been like almost automatic yes. And also I think the benefit to your point is like, if you have that thing, um, something about it being not a one-on-one conversation and aligned with something that you're working on just takes the hit rate up to like, it's unbelievable. Like it's just so much better conversion than asking for a one-on-one call with no attachment to any project.
Oh, I
Um,
wouldn't. I would never think to do that. It's such a faux pas,
yeah. So
which is some societal thing that is like it doesn't have to be that way, but it just is.
right.
The other thing is like, and this partially came about with I think just Farcaster generally. Like, not all people are like this, but I know I am. my creative expression is through entrepreneurial pursuits. Some people it's in other things and, there's not like an economic component, but to me, the
Right.
economics are actually what will make this interesting. And I think that people have different mixed opinions on this. Like some people say like, don't try to turn your hobby into a profession because you'll fall out of love with it or something. But I generally think that there's certain things that are just part of people's personalities that you're going to spend time and money on. And if you can find some way to earn or have, some sort of business associated with it, it can give you benefits for a whole bunch of reasons. One is like, I love reading. I spend a lot of money on books. By having a business associated with it, that is now a tax. That is now like an expense to that business
Right.
instead of being something personal, right? That's
Right.
one thing. The other is like it's just an opportunity to generally talk with authors who I otherwise wouldn't get a chance to. And I take it a little bit more seriously. I mean, like the the relationship that I have with books and reading is not super logical. It's more like a compulsion, and I don't quite know where it comes from. I think it's one of those like nature versus nurture things.
Right.
Um, and it always has been, and like that's not going to go away. But like I want to be able to hone it, and I want to be able to realize that this is something that um I used to not think it was very unique, but I don't know. I've read a couple of articles recently and I've just heard from people that like most people actually don't like reading or they find it intimidating or they just generally like don't like I know people that don't read any books ever, like
Yeah.
not one per year.
It's
And I get it.
interesting.
Like,
Can I just insert like a
yeah,
very
go ahead.
small fact? Like I saw
Sure.
something, I think it was Tim Urban, who I could be wrong about this, but I think it was Tim Urban. It's definitely someone who seems like they should be reading a ton or seems like they would like reading a ton. And maybe he does, but like I think it was Tim Urban who said he reads like on average like 5 or 6 books a year. It's very surprising to me. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's something that's a little bit of a scoreboard about trying to count how many books you read. And I generally don't think that's the right approach. Just because like I don't know. I know sometimes I'll read 25 pages of a book and be like, okay, I read the book. I got the point. I don't need to finish it.
Yeah.
And that to me is a very important part of the practice that a lot of people don't have. They buy a book and they
Yeah.
feel a need, whether it's like sunk cost fallacy or whether it's like they feel as though there's some echo of school where they're being naughty if they don't finish the assignment. And like that is just no way to live. Like pick it up, open to the middle, read from back to front, read from front to back, whatever you want to do. To get the message out of the book because with the exception of a few books, most books are filler. They're repeating the same point over and over again. And fiction isn't like this because it has sort of a plot and things, but like nonfiction, you can get the point pretty quickly. And so I like to be able to have an outlet that helps support this and also helps me, I think, put a little bit more conscious effort into something that's unconscious feels like something worth doing. And so I was hesitant around the time commitment for the hyper sub because I wanted to do a good job. I wanted it to be something that people felt as though they got value for. And ultimately, like I want it to be sustainable. I want to charge more for it than it costs me. And so far, so good. We'll see at the end of 6 weeks if I feel like I'm ready to do another one or if I want to take a break.
Yeah, it's I have a couple things. One is that it's kind of interesting. Like I was saying, this is like a terrible, objectively, like a pretty terrible time for me to start something new. I feel like this was also not a great time, just with some personal context on like your current like what you're doing right now, like where you're living and everything. It's like not the most sensible time ever for you to be doing this. And so the fact that you
Right.
are, I think, the fact that I'm doing the podcaster thing, like when you find yourself fighting the circumstances in order to do something, I feel like that's a good sign that your genuine interest is like super strong, basically like your desires are overcoming, uh, a non-ideal situation to do the thing anyway. And so I think that's a pretty good thing. And obviously, if you're going to be doing this on a recurring basis or reoccurring basis, then just having that knowledge that like, you started this at like a pretty not maybe that ideal time to be doing it is
Right.
like, yeah, this is definitely something that I should be doing. Like this is not that I should be doing, but that I should be doing because I want to be doing it.
Sure.
And I
Totally.
think that's good. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think it remains to be seen if this is like a short-term part-time thing or like a long-term part-time thing. I don't think it has the capacity, at least not right now, that I could be surprised for it to be like a full-time, long-term project. Um,
Right.
but I've been surprised before. I don't know. It just well, one thing about Farcaster is that it's such a fertile ground for people who want to try new things. And like, there's not, I mean, there's some communities where people are early adopters, but this is like a niche within a niche of people who are early adopters within a space that is already in and of itself self-selected for early adoption. And there's not many times or groups of people or clusters that are like this. Like teenagers is probably another one where you get people who are willing to try new things, but they're not really interested in like a broad range of products. They're mostly interested in like finding out what their friends think or getting a date or like, that's just, it's like a different class of problems.
Right.
Um, and so like, it just felt like, okay, there's this audience, there is this built-in economic model. I can feel okay charging for it because I know that if people don't want to pay for it, they won't. And like I'm not forcing anyone to do something they don't want to do. And
Right.
hopefully people are getting value out of it because I know it's a product that I want myself because I want the accountability and I want the network and the credential that comes from sticking to some topic that I'm interested in. And so that felt like a good thread to pull on.
Yeah, I'm also, just to circle back on, you sort of mentioned it there, but you mentioned it more explicitly previously of this concept of like, turning what you love to do into, your work that you get paid to do or whatever. And it's like, there's this risk to that, you love basketball and then you go and play in the NBA and like it becomes work and you no longer have passion for the sport or whatever. And I think like, I tend to agree with you. I seek uh, to connect these things in my life, like the things I like to do, with things that even if it's not necessarily paid immediately, so like the podcast, like I'm not getting paid, but like I like having interesting conversations with interesting people. Let me sort of like make that a foundational piece of my life, like something that I do that has like sort of a template that is easy to continue to do, makes it easier just to keep to do the thing. And I think, and then like eventually, like these things sort of overlap with business. So I think like there's merit on both sides of the argument. I think it's great to do, but I do think that the you know uh the potential for something that's fun for you and enjoyable to become something that you feel like you have to do for other reasons that no longer becomes fun. I do think that is a real risk. But I don't think there's just like sort of like a silver bullet clean solution. I just think you have to sort of be aware of that and like, you know, try to you just try to keep a balance there somehow. But I think it is
I just
worth doing.
I just remember that nobody cares, man. Like literally nobody cares about what you're doing or what you're working on. Like that's just
Yeah.
the default and that's just the way that
Yeah.
it is. Like I know I don't know if you have come across on Twitter a friend of mine David Farrell, he's like has a Twitter following, has been running
Yeah.
a writing course for a few years, Rite of Passage, and he announced that he was ending it recently. And like I don't know, I know him, I know people who work on that course. I'm sure it was an agonizing decision. And like when you're preparing to end something that you started, when you're preparing to move on from something, you have all of these thoughts. I'm gonna let people down, whatever. And like I just know my reaction, which is as someone who knows him and is fairly close to it, like has followed it. I was like, okay, good for him. He wants to move do something new. And I moved on. And like that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. Right. Like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was the extent of my emotional response to it. And it
Right.
kind of sucks because like you can pour your life energy into something for a couple years and like, barely get some sort of like spike out of people when you're announcing that it's over, but that's just the way that the world is. There's very few products or services that genuinely like need to continue. And sometimes it makes more sense to end a good thing at the top than to try to keep something going indefinitely because like you're doing it a disservice. You're doing the memory of it a disservice. And sometimes it's better just to let things sit and not try to mess with it too much. If the driving motivation behind it is gone and there's just some sense
Right.
of inertia that's keeping it going.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, takeaway. But also even more so like that original point, I try to remind myself all the time, like just nobody cares. Because it's actually
Nobody,
very freeing. You might feel
totally.
all of this obligation to other people, but realizing that they just do not care at all is, then that allows you to just do what you want and the way that you want to do it.
And like
because
and like
because
most
nobody
people
cares.
yeah, most people assume positive intent, right? And like, okay, you have good vibes from people, you have good energy. Like, as long as you didn't take money from people and promise them something and then not deliver it, like it's okay, right? You're fine. Um,
Yeah. The
and even so, like with some products, like people buy a product and the company goes out of business. Like, sorry, that's the way that it works. Like you bought the thing and you got the thing, and there wasn't an expectation that there was going to be more in the future. Um, yeah, I think inertia is a much larger force in people's lives than they think. I even know, I have friends who are still in jobs years after they've admitted to themselves that they don't like it, just out of a sense of inertia or obligation or something. Like, man, is it powerful and hidden and everywhere.
yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. There's a couple of things. So one thing is, I think a related point to no one caring is also that, uh, like, I'm trying to come up with like a quick hook basically, but like roughly, I'll explain it. But like roughly, like failure is fleeting and success is sticky, I guess.
Mhm.
And so like basically, what I mean by this is like, um, no, basically no one cares. Like, as a tangent to no one cares. Like when you fail at something, just like literally nobody cares. Like it's hard enough to get people's attention with things that work. No one has any attention for things that don't work. I mean, maybe like,
Totally.
there's a few examples like WeWork, Theranos, like these massive
Yeah.
blowups. But look at WeWork. Like the guy's out, he raised $350 million from A16Z because it's actually hard to fail that big. Like. So like as
Totally.
long as you
Yeah.
don't you know, commit a crime or like have actual fraud or whatever, it's like the fear of failure, it's so easy to say but so hard to actually adopt and operate upon, like this knowledge that like there's just no reason to try to avoid failure. In fact, you should probably try to fail a heck of a lot more. And just like it's sort of this, I think no one cares is like the highest level concept to keep in mind. And then like
Totally.
beneath that lies no one cares at all, or no one will remember any failures or really just like anything that you do. The best chance you have for someone to remember something that you've done is to do something like either that they love or have some sort of emotional resonance with, or something like very successful, that sort of like leaves a legacy or whatever. But just, it's so easy to know these things, like I just said, but it's like it is hard to sort of integrate them with just like who you are, how you are, whatever. And then the other point, where did where did we just leave off? I'm trying to remember. I had something else on your last point. I don't know if the inertia plays a bigger role than most people think. I remember like when after I was after my second year of banking, I wanted to leave for a year roughly. Was looking for other jobs, nothing was working out, and ultimately decided to leave without knowing what was next. And a big part of that decision was, first of all, like the Bezos regret minimization framework, like I mentioned earlier. It's like, am I more likely to regret not doing a third year in banking,
Totally.
um, or regret not taking the leap and betting on myself at this point in my life? And it was very clear from that perspective that there's only one answer to that. And then the other thing was making it, you have to pretend that there is no thing to have inertia. So you have to pretend that you are not in your job. Like for these friends you mentioned who are like, in these jobs that they know that they've talked about for years that they don't enjoy anymore. And like, it's not even that they don't enjoy it. It's like the logic even says like leave, but they just like, don't do it because the inertia is
Yeah.
so powerful. And I think the thing that you have to do at some point, it was helpful, like in banking, there's like these annual cycles. Um, but in any situation, like it's helpful to remove yourself from that situation if you can. Just basically, that's why I say just to pretend and to say, would I sign up for a third year?
Right.
Or even you could flip it to say, like, I'm not in investment banking right now. Like, I have no idea what I want to do, but I have this opportunity to sign up for this third year of banking with this group. Do I want to take it? And that's like a much different thing, because then you have to like decide to do something. It's hard to pretend that, but if you can, then like that sort of removes the inertia or even flips it in the other direction. And at least it might be sort of like a helpful counterweight for like making these sorts of decisions.
Yeah, I don't know. Mm, people have
I
different temperaments, right? And so I try not to overgeneralize based on my own like internal experience because I just
Right,
think the way that I operate is probably not the default for most people.
right,
And there's been enough times where like I've tried to like shake people and be like, dude, what are you doing? Do something, do something different. And the
right,
reality is like most people without some obligation to show up somewhere every day won't like go pursue their passion. They'll sit on the couch, you
right,
know? And like
right,
if there's not some positive alternative that's like a Pareto improvement. It's like, okay, maybe you and I can see it, but a lot of people don't have for whatever it is. Maybe it's a support structure, maybe it's the mental tools, maybe it's like some self-confidence thing, maybe there's something internal about like being able to deal with ambiguity.
right,
So I try to remember that when giving advice because I just think the advice that works for me is very different than what works for most people, and a lot of it I've had to like discover. Um, but I do think that there's a lot of people who are probably in this category who would benefit from some shock therapy and just never have to, but instead do the thing where you can forecast your payroll every year for the next 20 years and calculate exactly when you can afford the BMW and then exactly when you can afford the second house and do that until you die. And that just seems horrible. Um,
yeah. I
right.
go ahead. Did you have anything else, or
No,
um
yeah, I just,
yeah. So sorry, I didn't know, I didn't want to cut you off, but I think that's a super important point. It it reminds me of this situation. Like, I have friends similarly to you, that you see in these situations that there's just a lack of fulfillment, is usually sort of like the best summarizing thing, I
yeah,
think.
exactly.
And everyone deals with this like to some degree, I think. But when it's just like in your face, like this is not the thing. And at a certain point, I think like your light goes. I don't know. I go back and forth on this, but like there's this there's an idea that maybe you have this spark or this light that um man, I've got like three different things to talk about right now. But so there's this idea that you have this spark or this light that the question is that inherent to you, that you have it in a way that will be persistent where others might not? Or is it something that everyone actually has, or most people have, that goes out if you don't protect it and guard it? And
Uh,
so
yeah.
when I was in banking, I remember thinking part of this decision with the third year was like, um, you know, I still have this desire to like do things differently. I'm here in this group of like this total track of a career, and I still have this like burning desire to do things differently, like this
Mhm.
independent minded attitude. And I remember thinking like, is that something that I have to worry about losing if I continue down this? If I if that feeling, Steve Jobs has the thing about like if you look in the mirror too many days in a row and you know that you're
Yeah.
not doing like the thing that you should be doing or that you want to be doing, like you need to change something. And it's like
Yep.
people, you don't want to take that too literally, because you don't want to have like three off days and then like quit your job that actually was like
Right.
really good or that you really liked or something. But it's just a feel to it. And it's like I said, I'd been looking for a job for months. I had transferred offices from San Francisco to New York, which was like a helpful reset, which definitely gave me additional months of life and of energy towards it. But at a certain point, it's like, this is not it. And if you get to that sort of subjective point where you've looked in the mirror too many days in a row, or enough days in a row that it's time to move, and if at that point you don't act on it, I wonder if like sort of that is the point at which the spark goes out. Like once you've
Mm.
once you take a cold shower, if you've never taken a cold shower before, you take a cold shower, you're like, oh man, that kind of like was tough, but like feels really good. And like you're much more inclined to take more cold showers. And this is like a stupid example, but just for anything, you're much more likely to do something once you've done it once. And so I think once you settle materially on what you do in your day-to-day life, uh, in a way where like you feel like you're at this point and like it's enough. And if you don't act on it at that point, I wonder if like that spark sort of goes away forever, or at least goes
Mhm.
away in a way that is very hard to get back. But then on the other hand, I wonder if like maybe not, maybe this sort of spark, as I call it, or whatever, is something that is intrinsic for me, that I have this desire to do things differently that not everyone has. And maybe that is just who I am, and I could do banking for 7 years and it wouldn't go away, and it would maybe like express itself in other ways, or more likely, I wouldn't. There's just no way I would be in banking for 7 years, because if I didn't leave after two, I would have almost certainly left after three, and if I didn't leave after three, I almost certainly would have left after four or something like that. And so I don't really know, but it's something to think about. And then the other thing I wanted to say off of your point, which is like, you have to realize that, you may or may, everyone may or may not be the same as you in certain ways. And more likely than not, like everyone is different. And I remember like one of these friends that I had, like in the situation you described, he's working at Google, very unfulfilled, and, but, making good money, easy job, whatever, very, very hard, like golden handcuffs sort of thing. And I was like, and he's like, doing these like wine, he's like becoming like a sommelier or whatever, like taking these wine classes. He's like learning different languages. He's learning how to do these like different, he's taking like this dance class. He's got like all these like extracurriculars going on, because he has the time and like he can. And I remember I was like, he's telling me how he doesn't like his job, but I'm like, but he's telling me how he's doing these other things that he's really enjoying. And I'm like, I don't know, like I'm not, I could just be like, dude, like you're really unfulfilled in your job. You should do something different. You should take these passions that you have and like work them into your day to day, you know, make them your work somehow. And, but I didn't say that because I was like, who am I to say? Like, I don't have life solved. And like,
Totally.
maybe working the cushy job at Google, making a ton of money and being able to travel a ton and explore all these other interests you want outside of your work time is like, maybe that's a great way to live, if not for me, for other people. So like, I sort of didn't tell him, but then I sort of came around over years of persistent him having that unfulfillment with his job. Like, and now I'm sort of back on the side of like, all right, I wasn't sure before, but I feel more strongly now. Like it comes down to also like knowing your friend. Like I know that
Yep,
he
yep.
is one of these people who he's such an interesting dude, and like has all of these interests as they're being expressed by these things that he's doing on the side. And I'm just like, you just got to be doing something more interesting with the core of your work than something that you don't enjoy. And even if it's not interesting to me, it doesn't matter. But it's like it's got to be something that you like, because otherwise, if you're not doing, it comes back to the Steve Jobs thing again. It's like the only way to do great work is to do something that you love. And I know he has greatness, and it's just it hurts to see it not given the opportunity, basically. So anyway, I know also we're like literally an hour, I scheduled this for half an hour and we're coming up on an hour and a half. And I have a thing in 8 minutes. So let's wrap
Oh,
this up, and hopefully, I don't know if, hopefully you didn't miss anything. But it's been awesome conversation, obviously. Um, anything on anything I just said, or should we sort of, get towards a wrap?
I think if we don't wrap now, we'll probably go for another hour. So how about we leave
Yeah.
it to be continued?
All right. Let's leave it at, to be continued. Um, awesome conversation as usual. I genuinely, I mean, you tell me, but I don't, it's hard to find any way in which this differentiated from one of our normal calls other than removal of small talk, which is mostly just like a way to start and end anyway. Like it's, not really, this is the sort of the meat of it. So that's pretty cool to see. Because with my podcast, like I don't really do conversations with people I've talked to a lot previously. And so anyway, excellent experiment, and looking forward to hopefully continuing. And next time we do it, hopefully you'll be out for a walk as well, and we'll do the Ray-Ban to Ray-Ban Connect.
Sounds good. Hopefully you're not like 10 miles away from home.
No, I'm getting close, because I actually just literally, as I finished speaking right there, my Ray-Bans gave me the first sound that sounded like they're dying
Okay.
soon. So I got to get home and take this other thing at 11. But thanks for joining me in the experiment, and we'll talk more soon. Off or on the record.
Cool. Talk to you later.
All right, peace.